Welcome to the Faces podcast. We're a Christian and Muslim charity working to build resilience in faith communities against child sexual exploitation and other forms of harm. We'll be talking about what faith and interfaith work means to us and how we embed an inclusive and authentic approach throughout our work.
Welcome to our podcast. Today we are going to be discussing the sentencing of Eleanor Williams, a 22-year-old from Borough in Furness, who was charged with 9 counts of perverting the course of justice. It's a very sad case. It plays on a narrative coming out of Rochdale and basically blaming Asian gangs for something that these innocent people didn't do. And so it's a case that brings up a lot of different issues regarding child protection, exploitation, religion, gangs, a whole load of issues on how the police investigate things. It brings up issue after issue and is so damaging. There are lives that have been ruined by this. There are businesses that have gone down as a result of some of these lies. There is even a paper that is no longer in existence, possibly due to some of these things that was mentioned in sentencing. And also there are people living lives in fear of reprisals from the public over lies that have been told about them, who, even in the sentencing, when that's been brought up, probably aren't safe to go wherever they want to go in these days. And so in all of this is a narrative, and also that narrative can be very damaging to victims coming forward in the future. And there's a lot in the story. There's a lot of public support that got behind these lies. I think they said something like 100,000 people on Facebook supporting some of these situations. That's a weight of public opinion, but behind a lie. And that's been exposed. The sentencing that has come out this week, live on TV, actually showed us that there are lies upon lies and layers of lies. And on top of that, incredible lengths to try and fabricate evidence to back up those lies. Even this girl hit herself with a hammer to form injuries on herself to actually back up some of her lies. There's psychiatric reports on it. The mystery around it is, why did she do this? Why on earth would someone do this to other people's lives? There's a lot of layers to this. And with me today, I've got Peter Adams and Lucy joining me to chat through these aspects and the different implications of this. And this is a story that's broken, but has massive ramifications, massive things we can learn from it. And so I'd like to throw that open and see what wisdom you guys have to bring on some of these things.
Yes, I think so. I think we know from the ways that the media reported some of the abuse that happened in Rochdale and Rotherham and different places in Telford, that described the criminal exploitation and the sexual exploitation by Muslim grooming gangs, and created this fear of Muslim men as sexual predators. And the way that was particularly as a kind of machine of real fear and hatred, it was fed and fed and fed by the media, and then energized by a lot of white men in far-right gangs themselves, stirring up real fear and racial hatred and fear of Muslims. And we know that created 2 really problematic things. One is a fear of people in safeguarding responding to real evidence that things were going wrong and that young women really were being abused, a fear of acting on it because they didn't want to be seen to be racist. Because this racism was present against Muslim Pakistani men in particular, and a conflation of their identities with being sexual predators, that meant that people whose job it was to protect young women in particular didn't act on evidence and concerns because they were afraid, in some part, of the backlash against those men that would be present in the wider community. And I think, in part, what we can see is that those fears were founded because look what happened. Not just to, we know that the men in this case, the couple of white men that she accused, whose lives have been utterly devastated by these false accusations, but we also see what was triggered and activated was the fear of Muslim men, and this idea that the network of Muslim businesses that are sort of waiting to exploit or abuse young white girls. And some of the problematic thing is that we saw a reaction from the public of the injustice of inaction previously in cases like Rochdale and Rotherham, where people did not intervene. That actually what happens now when there's a false accusation is 100,000 people go, well, in the past, no one did anything. And so it's our job to buy the merchandise, to share the images, to write, racist or, graffiti on the side of someone's house. I think that the case said that there was a tripling of hate crimes in the local area that summer when this was going on during lockdown. That kind of sense of almost like vigilante justice, because we can't trust the system to do the right thing. The irony is that underneath all of that is the same thing, I would suggest, which is a misunderstanding of what is driving sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. It is not someone's religion. No. It's not even their gender, although actually the particular problematic experience of masculinity does drive it. But it's not essentially being a male, and it's not essentially being a Pakistani, and it's not owning a business or any of those things.
Yeah. And this, thank you, Lucy. Both of you have expressed this so brilliantly. And actually I think I'm just sitting here reflecting on it, takes us right back to the reason that a few of us got together and started Faces. It was the way that abuse, child sexual abuse, exploitation was being utilised in different places and the narratives around it. Yes, one of them was the Muslim grooming gang stories, but actually the presence, the justification, the apparent use of religion to justify abuse and so on. There was so much going on that we said we can't. We've got to work together to counter some of these narratives. And yes, very early on, the Muslim grooming gang story was one. But as I look on now after several years of doing this stuff, actually looking back at the beginning, our fears of what that narrative could do and would do in society have just become more and more evident. It's been there. It's been driving the far right stories right back to 2005 and so on in Yorkshire with the growth of the British National Party, the BNP, and the way that the stories in Keighley and so on drove the elections there. It was there driving some of the early thinking of the English Defence League here in Luton. It's been there in so many places now, and that narrative has just got out. Even just a few weeks ago, the stories around that hotel with asylum seekers up in Liverpool, the thing that fired the crowd were the stories of apparent attempts to groom a young white girl by a refugee. That was what stirred it all up. And they responded to a story. And so it's just run on time after time after time over the years. It's one of the principal things that is raised against refugees. And we see the impact of this story now just loose in the community and taken for granted that a young woman is able to put together a story, to fabricate a story of abuse, and nobody asks any questions about it. Nobody questions its veracity, because as soon as it's claimed, it is a given that Muslim men do this stuff. I'm just sitting thinking here, here we are, three Christians today without any of our Muslim colleagues, but actually together saying totally that the work we've been doing is, I hate to say, personally, it's horrible to have to say this case proves everything we've been saying. But actually the reality is it does.
Yeah.
I take no joy in that whatsoever because of as you just said, Nigel and Lucy, the hundreds of lives messed up by this. It's so tragic. But actually, it's good to be able to sit back and reflect on this story and the way that actually it says what we've been doing for the last 8 years or so since we started thinking about faces. It's just been so important.
I know. I think it intersects with a number of things that are sort of happening in our culture and more widely that all come together in these moments. So we have seen our Prime Minister, stand up and with the slogan "Stop the boats," and that what he and Suella Braverman are trying to do in their response and trying to politically respond to people's fears of immigration intersects with not just a fear of immigration generally, of this sense of being overwhelmed as a nation by people, but it's about ideas of who these people are and how we see them. And I think we see in moments like this, that story you were just saying, talking about, Peter, of the fear of who we are putting in hotels and only giving £5 a day to eat kind of sandwiches from the local shop, and moving children around who are in these hotels as well, just endlessly because we are not looking after them. That it is. That intersects with a fears of not just being overwhelmed, but fears that whoever we are letting in is a threat to us, a threat to our children, a threat to our kind of families, or a threat to our nation or our sense of identity. And I think I saw this on Twitter last week because somebody who I knew through when I was working in this field, kind of CSE research, probably 5 years ago or so, Ella Cobain, who had put in a complaint about a news programme, Grooming Gangs, Britain Shame, and she put in a complaint to say this programme again draws on those same racist ideas that there are Muslim grooming gangs out there and we all need to be afraid. She said that this breaches all kinds of guidelines and laid out how that happened. But what happened on Twitter then, in terms of the backlash to her just saying this isn't okay to talk about people in this way, just reveals just how important it is that we keep talking about this, because these men essentially who are gathering together, I think, who have kind of St. George's crosses on their Twitter feeds, were posting images of loaded guns pointed to her head, saying they're going to come for you next. You're not protecting the children. You're part of the problem. And it is so important that we say in these moments, that is not what is going on. That is not what is happening here. Because otherwise, we're going to just see more and more that space taken up by all of that hatred and violence, actually.
Yeah, and I think we're living in a world where narratives are incredibly powerful and systems are showing their cracks. And so coming out of COVID, you're seeing a lot of things where a lot of negative press towards police and a lot of negative press towards government, a lot of negative press to all the institutions around. And as a result of that, there's belief in community narratives that is imperfect and people are running with. And so instead of racializing organized criminal gangs, criminal gangs operate all over the world in every single nation and in England from an English base as well. And so the danger is, just because there are criminal gangs out there who will do horrendous things to people in all societies, trying to limit it to one racial group or two racial groups or a few racial groups to try and say that it's the other people that are the problem hides the issue that is a problem in every single nation. And so there's some of these narratives. There is a need to be aware of criminal gangs, but to compartmentalize it into different groups in society that you want to take down is not a clever approach, and there's very, very dangerous approach. And I think this is part of one of the dangers that this story exposes is the unspoken narratives that are operating underneath the surface of society and are more powerful than the systems that are meant to protect people in people's minds. And I think combined with this is the difficulty of trying to hear victims' voices. And I know from other experiences that there is a desperation in investigating forces to hear victims' voices more, to expose criminal gangs more. And a story like this that kind of crushes that in its outworkings is very damaging for frail people who need to speak up on some of these things and need to be heard coming forward. And so there's a number of narratives coming through this that I think expose holes in society, expose holes in things, but also expose vulnerabilities. And it's how we cover those vulnerabilities. And I don't think the way media has covered some of these things is helpful. And I don't think that's going to bring greater success into some of these areas. There's a need for people to understand that gangs operate through society, and a recognition of that doesn't limit or racialize it.
And if we look at what was in the press in the last week, that more than 1,500 police officers have been accused of violent offences against women and girls over a 6-month period. That's only 6 months in the last kind of year. Then that's a really good reminder of what we tend to do, which is as humans, we take the thing that we are afraid of in ourselves and that in those closest to us, and we project it onto another group to make them the enemy. And so the challenge for all of us is to see that this kind of violence is much closer than we would like to believe. Like we know that most abuse happens within the family, those who are most close. And that's really hard to come to terms with. And so what we really do psychologically is we push that threat out and say, it's not in here, it's not in my home, it's not in those that look like me, it's in the monsters, and the monsters are those other people. But what, of course, we have to face in this is in every institution. So we know in the Christian church how Christian churches and powerful people have colluded to shut down victims, that they have hidden and not brought perpetrators to justice. We know how close in that these things are to us, and we know it's in the police. We know it's all sorts of places. So the sooner we can all go, why, rather than free, the sooner we can say, why does this happen? How can we prevent it? The sooner we'll actually do what everybody wants to do, which is reduce this violence.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's totally right, Lucy. And I a little bit of me wants to take off on the Christian church piece there, but we can do that another time. Just on this story, Nigel, we were talking before we started recording this about some of the elements that really come out immediately out of this story. What did this narrative look like when it started opening out, when it became clear what was happening there in Barrow? You've read more of the immediate story of this than either of us have. What did this look like?
Well, I think it's at what point the story broke. And I think on from reading in some of the news articles, it seems that one of the big points, the big turning point, was when Eleanor put stuff up on social media. That was a big point. It went public, ended up with over 100,000 people following those posts. Bearing in mind that this was during lockdown, and during lockdown, everyone was living on social media. And so narratives on social media are very powerfully driven, and actually more powerfully driven than many of the things on the news articles, which were rather samey, doing the same thing on COVID and following a line to try and protect people. There was stuff happening on social media that was all over the place. And so I think some of those narratives went in deep there. Also, I think combined with that, you also had this sense of something change. Things became about people's own homes, and so the understanding of how to other people became stronger. And so I almost saw, this is my personal view, I saw COVID as an incubation time for separation, really, where people went with their own ideas into a bunker and those ideas got stronger and coming out. Yeah. And so in some of these things combined, a number of things came together to make the perfect storm here. And I'm not, we're in other settings or previous years, it may not have been as strong as it was. But I think the COVID did have an element to play in this, as far as I can tell, looking at the news articles.
So you've got a young woman telling a story, putting it on social media, 100,000 odd people responding in a very in a climate that was very fertile for stories, narratives, conspiracies, all those sort of things, because everybody was. This was probably a welcome rabbit hole for people to go down instead of the COVID conspiracies. And so you get that story out there in social media that is now shown to be groundless, and then you get what was the response to that? I mean, people didn't question it; they took it as fact, primarily because the narrative out there amongst many of that 100,000 people is that it is point proven that Muslim men do this stuff, and therefore you don't need to begin to even critique it. You don't need to check it. You just assume it's true. And amongst those who took that story up were notorious far-right characters like Stephen, like Ashley Lennon, Tommy Robinson, who pick up on these stories and then immediately multiply them out 100 times further than they've already gone. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you had situations like a restaurant going from 70 to 80 orders a night down to single figures
because they were tied up in this story.
So let's think about what's the impact of something like this. So one thing to just be conscious of is, on the one hand, trauma plays out in can be quite distinct ways. For some people, it plays out in kind of externalizing, so in conflict and aggression and things that, particularly if you're a young man, get labeled as, well, this makes sense because you're a man, so we expect this kind of behavior from you, and people don't look and go, could this person have been abused? But also internalizing behaviors. So, and that, I'm not to say that this is always how it goes in terms of gender, but it plays out, the point is trauma plays out in unexpected ways. So for some, there is a question in this case, which is, can we make sense of why someone would do this in relation to their own story? This kind of thing doesn't tend to come from nowhere. No. So there have been psychological reports, etc. But I suppose what I would observe is that what we tend to see when someone has experienced profound sexual abuse and trauma is that it's really hard to talk about it, and people often take a long time to disclose because they are really scared of what will happen when they do. So a piece of research that came out of my team a while ago was that it takes an average about 7 years for someone to talk, because they tend to know when they say something, the reaction they might be, if it's someone in their family, it's very hard to say, my uncle did this or my mother did this, because you have a complicated relationship with that person and you know what's going to happen is going to disrupt profoundly the place that you live. Now, imagine if you add into that the way that the public perceive the faith or the ethnicity of the person that did something to you. So if you are a white young woman who is 15 and you say to your friend, you finally get up the courage to say, someone I know did this to me, that's going to be very hard. But probably what's not going to happen is that person immediately thinks the reason they did that to you is because they're white and they're a Christian. And that's exactly what I expect of white Christian men. But if you are a Muslim young woman who's 15 and you take the risk of saying to your white friend, this person in my life who happens to share the same ethnicity and religion as me, because it is also the case that just as Christian white men will abuse Christian white young women, Muslim Pakistani men might abuse Pakistani Muslim young women, because it happens in every culture. But what is activated if you disclose in our society that the perpetrator happened to be Muslim and Pakistani is that happened because they were Muslim and Pakistani. And therefore, if you are that victim, are you going to say anything? Because you know that is not the case. That's not the case that they did it because of that. But what will get triggered and activated is this awful thing that is in our culture, which is that you are now going to write off all the people who are also share that faith or share that ethnic background, because you think it's because they are that this happened. And so you're less likely to disclose. So that's why we have to resist this, because we need as many young people for whom this has happened to talk about it and feel safe to talk about it, and know that whoever's going to listen to them is not going to jump to assumptions that do violence to that part of their identity. Because what you're saying is like, well, your Muslim identity is a problem, because we think that the Muslim identity more generally is a problem and that we associate it with abuse, and that's not the case.
And I think it's also authorities' abilities to deal with some of these things, and the belief and the lack of sort of religious literacy and other such things in authorities propound this issue, because they feel awkward. I don't know how to deal with this, and as a result of that, deal with it in a particular way that isn't always helpful in the way forward. And so,
Nigel, what's the story with the police's treatment and response to this story? When did they get involved with it?
I think they got involved fairly early on, as far as we know. So reports were being made. So there was an initial report she did of abuse from someone, and then from that, it started a whole system. So there were many reports she made accusing men of abuse. And one of those young guys, Jordan Trengove, spent 73 days in prison as a result of some false rape claim there until he was released. And that fell down because she withdrew her case from the prosecution, and then he was told he was released. But then the stigma of all of that stayed with him, and to this day. So there were issues of false rapes to start with, and then gradually the stories got worse and worse. The police were involved from when things were reported initially.
When did they take on a racial dimension?
I'm not sure the police in what's come out necessarily did. But what I'm saying is, in a lot of cases, there is an awkwardness in authorities, and so I think and a lot of them are working hard on it. So I think it's not necessarily.
I was thinking more of when. Sorry, just not clear there. When did the racial dimension in her accusations take? Were they there from the beginning, or was Was it?
Well, this is what in the sentencing, the judge said he couldn't make this a racial issue in terms of this, because her accusations were all different nationality.
Right.
It was white and Asian and so on. There was no discrepancy in her regarding these things.
But the far right obviously picked up.
I think the Guardian article said that Eleanor Williams, sort of some of her worst allegations were for Mohammed Ramzan, and what she said was that he was the head of an international grooming gang who trafficked her and dozens of other girls around northwest England and abroad. And all you need to do is hear that story. And unless she said the same thing about the two other white men around, both being heading up the grooming gangs, that language, and the trafficking, that particular, because we know those were features of cases in Rochdale and Rotherham, but the narrative around the association of Muslim Pakistani businessmen with the gangs and the trafficking, which then took off in the kind of public media and public imagination, which hasn't been well challenged enough. I think unless she had those same accusations for the others, I think we could look at that and say, even if we can't establish that it was racially motivated, what she was drawing on in the shape of her accusations was certainly an understanding of what is going to energise the public for my cause, and the kind of defences, people leaping to her defence and buying merchandise and all the rest of it.
Yeah. And I think at some point she must have felt that feeling of power, of public support, and I'm sure that affected things. But her own sister witnessed against her for the prosecution, basically showing that a holiday that they'd taken her on for her birthday was this whole, she presented as part of that. And I think the family breakdown in this would be horrendous. In fact, this story just has breakdown at every single point in it. It's a story of pain, probably in Eleanor as well.
Exactly, and that's the fact that is so sad about this, that it's probably some deep issue that she's experienced somewhere back, way beyond. Yeah. That is now manifesting itself in so many stories that are ruining other lives.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things brought out by the sentencing. So I listened to the judge's sentencing, and in that, this mystery of why she did what she did. Yeah. Is still there, still hangs over. No one knows. She hasn't opened up about it. It hasn't come from anywhere. She refused, even in her final statement, says, I'm not saying I'm guilty. I made a few mistakes, but I'm not saying I'm guilty. Yeah. That leaves every single one of these people still in danger in society. It leaves everything raw. And for what purpose? Is it for an appeal later? Is it for any of these things? But she's gone down for, 8.5 years, and she'll serve half of that and then come out on license. And so that's basically what will happen going forwards from here. I think our thing in looking at this is to look, what lessons can we learn from this sad occasion? Are there things that need to be spoken of into society to help the situations like this not occur, and actually enable victims to come forward? I think there's a number of things here where this shows the vulnerabilities of society more than it shows just the vulnerabilities of a girl who's been false. It shows a lot more about us as a society.
Yeah. I suppose the one thing is really important to underline right at the beginning is that sexual abuse, men upon girls, men upon young men, every which way, does take place. Mm-hmm. And however false her stories were, the reality is we know it is a huge problem in society. And we can't deny that. And we want to be supportive of anybody who's coming forward to make allegations. And we also want to make sure that their claims are taken seriously And sadly, the sad reality is she's made it very hard for people who have been abused to come forward.
Yes, I think that's right. I think we have to ask ourselves, how could I personally, and then my community, my institution, be as safe a place as possible for somebody to talk about what is happening or has happened, or what is going on in terms of any kind of abuse, and start there, and to look at what is it that would make me unsafe, and whether that's about making assumptions about what's happened, about victims or perpetrators, the kinds of knee-jerk reactions that actually don't help victims and make abuse more likely to be driven underground, which only serves to embolden those who want to abuse because they're protected by that. So anything that makes it less safe for people to disclose perpetuates abuse and means it carries on in secret and in silence and in the dark. So I think this is one of those stories that just shows us this will make it easier for people to abuse rather than harder. And so let's not be those people that uncritically just share things without curiosity, that make assumptions about who abuses and why. Let's stay open-minded, curious, and more than anything, look at what is closest to us and people like us that makes abuse possible.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think that this will run and run. But I think in looking at this, there are some very key issues regarding truth and social media and some of those things that you've got a paper that went down, part of this thing, whether that was the factor that killed it off or not, but actually people who did have the courage to report news and report straight ended up being persecuted and pushed down. There's a lot in this of narrative stories where society is, and I think there's a lot to learn and process through this, and I hope that can be done effectively going forward, and protect victims and bring them out to be able to tell their stories, and I think also for law enforcement is actually believing them, but also keeping a critical eye on the whole situation as well, and working through and finding those points where they have to go, actually, there's a lot of false things here. This isn't going the way it needs to. But I think that belief in the public needs to be something, and how media handle themselves around these issues are very key.
Yeah.
Anyway, shall we leave it there? And thank you for listening to our podcast, and hopefully you can join us next week as well. Okay.
Thanks so much, Nigel.
Thank you.